I used to believe children only repeated what they heard. Then one little girl looked into my eyes, smiled with heartbreaking innocence, and whispered, "Mister, every time you left, you made my mommy cry." In that single moment, the entire ballroom disappeared around me. The music, the polite applause, the soft conversations floating beneath crystal chandeliers, all of it faded into silence until there was nothing left except her voice echoing inside my head. I had faced federal investigators without flinching. I had negotiated billion-dollar deals while men twice my age struggled to hide their fear. Yet 6 simple words from a child barely tall enough to reach my waist stole every thought from my mind. She couldn't have been older than 6. Golden blonde hair rested neatly on her shoulders, her pale cheeks glowing beneath the warm lights of the charity gala, and her bright blue eyes searched mine with a familiarity that unsettled me more than any threat ever had. She wasn't afraid of me. That alone made her different from almost everyone else in the room. Adults always recognized power before they recognized the man behind it. They lowered their voices when I entered. They straightened their jackets. They carefully chose every word. But children saw something entirely different. They looked for kindness before authority. She tilted her head and continued studying my face as though trying to solve a puzzle she had carried for years. Before I could answer, a woman rushed through the crowd. "Lily." Her voice trembled just enough for me to hear it. She reached the little girl and gently placed both hands on her shoulders. "I told you not to wander away." The child looked up at her mother without taking her eyes completely off me. "I'm sorry, Mommy. I just wanted to ask him why you always cried after he left." Every muscle in my body locked. The woman froze too. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she lifted her gaze toward mine. Emily Carter. 7 years had passed since I'd last seen her face, yet I recognized her instantly. Time had softened nothing. She was still the woman who could silence every room simply by walking into it, although now there was exhaustion resting behind her beautiful blue eyes. She wore an elegant navy dress that somehow couldn't hide the weight life had placed on her shoulders. A few loose strands of chestnut hair framed her face, and for the briefest second our eyes met exactly the way they had years ago before everything fell apart. She looked shocked, then hurt, then guarded. It happened so quickly, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined every emotion crossing her face. "Lily," she said quietly, forcing a gentle smile, "we need to go." The little girl frowned. "But Mommy, that's him." Emily's fingers tightened around her daughter's small hand. "Please." She didn't look at me again. She simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd before I could move, before I could ask the question burning inside my chest. I watched them leave, unable to breathe normally, unable to understand why a child who had never met me spoke as if she had known me forever. Then I noticed something lying forgotten beside the chair where Lily had been standing. A tiny pink backpack. Embroidered across the front were 2 words that made my heart stop for an entirely different reason. Lily Moretti. I picked up the backpack with hands that suddenly felt unfamiliar. The soft pink fabric contrasted so sharply with the polished black marble beneath my shoes that it almost looked unreal. Moretti. My last name was stitched in careful white thread across the front pocket, clean and unmistakable. I stared at it far longer than I should have. Hundreds of possibilities flashed through my mind, each one more unreasonable than the last. Moretti was not an uncommon Italian name in New York. There had to be another explanation. There had to be. Yet my pulse refused to slow. "Sir." My head of security stepped beside me, his voice deliberately quiet. "Should I return it to the guest list desk?" I did not answer immediately. Instead, I unzipped the smallest compartment just enough to identify its owner. Inside sat a tiny watercolor sketchbook, 3 crayons worn nearly to the paper, and a laminated library card. Lily Moretti. My throat tightened before I could stop it. The photograph showed the same smiling little girl who had just shattered every certainty I had built over the past 7 years. I closed the zipper carefully, almost afraid I might damage something that belonged to her. "Find Emily Carter," I said without taking my eyes off the backpack. "No alarms. No pressure. Just tell her daughter forgot something." He nodded once and disappeared into the crowd with the silent efficiency that had protected my life for years. I remained exactly where I was, surrounded by senators, business executives, and philanthropists who continued their conversations as though nothing extraordinary had happened. That was the strange thing about charity galas in Manhattan. Entire lives could collapse beneath crystal chandeliers while the string quartet continued playing and waiters kept refilling champagne glasses. I looked toward the ballroom entrance where Emily had vanished only minutes earlier. The last time I had seen her before tonight, rain had covered the city in silver reflections. She had stood outside a small bookstore in Brooklyn wearing an oversized blue sweater, asking me one impossible question. If you walk away tonight, will you ever come back? I had answered without hesitation. When it is safe. At the time I believed those words. I convinced myself distance was protection. Every difficult choice I made had been built on that single belief. If I disappeared, she could have the ordinary future she deserved, untouched by my complicated world. I never imagined silence could leave scars deeper than presence. 20 minutes passed before my security chief returned. His expression told me everything before he spoke. She left through the west entrance. I felt something sink inside me. Did she say anything? Only thank you for returning the backpack. He hesitated. She asked us not to contact her again. I nodded slowly, pretending the words landed with less force than they actually did. Then he handed me a folded sheet of construction paper that had slipped from the front pocket. This was inside. I unfolded it carefully. Crayon drawings filled the page. A little girl stood between a smiling woman and a tall man in a dark suit. Above the three stick figures were uneven block letters written with obvious concentration. My family. Beneath the tallest figure, in bright blue crayon, was a single word that stole the air from my lungs once again. Daddy. I did not sleep that night. The construction paper remained on my desk long after every employee had gone home, illuminated by the single lamp that overlooked the Manhattan skyline. I had reviewed mergers worth hundreds of millions of dollars with less attention than I gave that simple drawing. The woman wore a yellow dress. The little girl held both adults by the hand. The man, drawn with oversized shoulders and an uneven smile, wore a black suit and blue tie. A child had imagined him as someone who belonged there, someone who came home, someone who stayed. I traced the word daddy with my thumb, wondering how many times Lily had written it before she decided those letters looked perfect enough to keep forever. None of it made sense. Emily had disappeared from my life 7 years earlier without another message. Every attempt I made to find her had ended the same way. Empty apartment, disconnected phone number, former co-workers who genuinely believed she had moved somewhere out west. Eventually, I convinced myself she wanted a life that did not include me. It hurt less than believing something worse. Around 6 the next morning, I asked my assistant to cancel every meeting before noon. She blinked in surprise, but wisely asked no questions. Instead, I drove myself across the East River toward Brooklyn, something I had not done in years without a carefully planned schedule. The address on the library card belonged to a small neighborhood branch surrounded by brick buildings, coffee shops, and maple trees beginning to lose their summer leaves. It was exactly the kind of place Emily had always loved. Ordinary, quiet, safe. I parked across the street and waited. Parents arrived pushing strollers. Children raced toward the entrance with backpacks bouncing behind them. Elderly neighbors greeted one another by name. Nobody paid attention to the black sedan parked beneath the trees. For the first time in years, anonymity felt strangely comforting. Nearly 40 minutes later I saw them. Emily stepped onto the sidewalk holding Lily's hand. She wore jeans, white sneakers, and a light gray cardigan that moved gently in the morning breeze. There was nothing glamorous about her appearance, yet she somehow stood out more than anyone else on the block. Lily skipped beside her carrying the same pink backpack, laughing about something I could not hear. Emily laughed too. It was softer than I remembered, but unmistakably hers. I realized then that I had not heard that sound in 7 years. Without thinking, I opened the car door. The movement caught Lily's attention first. Her face lit up with immediate recognition. She tugged excitedly on her mother's sleeve and pointed directly at me. Emily turned. Our eyes met across the quiet street. Her smile disappeared instantly. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Cars rolled past between us while the city continued its ordinary morning rhythm. Finally, I crossed the street slowly, stopping several feet away to make certain she never felt cornered. Lily smiled as though we were old friends. Emily looked as though she was preparing for a storm. Before I could say a single word, Lily reached into her backpack, pulled out another drawing, and proudly handed it to me. This one showed only two people standing beneath a bright yellow sun. Above them she had written in careful crayon letters, "Mommy says heroes always come back, even if they are late." Emily stepped forward before I could reach for the drawing. Her fingers closed gently around Lily's shoulder, not pulling her away but reminding both of us where the boundary stood. "Lily," she said softly, "your teacher is waiting." The little girl looked from her mother to me, clearly disappointed that adults always interrupted conversations children believed should continue. "Can I give him my picture?" she asked. Emily hesitated only a second before nodding. "Yes." "Then we have to go." Lily placed the drawing into my hands with the kind of trust that had to be earned, not bought. "Do not lose this one," she whispered with complete seriousness. "It took me all Saturday." I smiled before I realized I was doing it. "I will keep it safe." Her face brightened as though I had just made the most important promise in the world. She waved enthusiastically before skipping toward the library entrance, leaving Emily and me standing alone beneath the fading shade of the maple trees. The silence between us felt heavier than any conversation we had ever shared. She folded her arms loosely, not out of anger, but self-protection. I recognized the gesture immediately. She had done the same thing years ago whenever she was trying not to cry. "She is beautiful," I finally managed. Emily looked toward the library doors where Lily had disappeared inside. "She is." Her voice softened for the first time. "She is the best thing that ever happened to me." I nodded slowly. "Emily, I need to understand." She closed her eyes for a brief moment before meeting my gaze again. "No, Vincent. You need to let us live." The words landed quietly, yet they carried more weight than a shouted accusation ever could. "If Lily..." I stopped myself, struggling to choose words that would not sound like demands. "If there is something I should know." She looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not hatred, not fear, just exhaustion. "There was a time when I wanted you to know everything." Her eyes drifted toward the morning traffic passing behind me. I waited longer than I should have. Then I stopped waiting. My chest tightened. I came back. A sad smile touched her lips, disappearing almost as quickly as it appeared. "You came back years too late." Neither of us spoke after that. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang 9 times. A delivery truck rolled past, followed by a cyclist balancing a paper bag full of fresh bread. The city continued living as though two broken people were not quietly standing in the middle of it. Emily adjusted the strap of her purse and took a slow breath. "I do not hate you, Vincent." Those words surprised me more than anything else she could have said. I spent a long time trying to. It would have been easier. She looked directly into my eyes. "But eventually I realized that hating someone keeps them in your life just as much as loving them does." She turned to leave, then paused after only 2 steps. Without facing me, she spoke one final sentence. "Please do not make Lily choose between the father she dreams about and the man you really are." She walked into the library without looking back. I remained on the sidewalk holding 2 crayon drawings that suddenly felt more valuable than everything I owned. Then my phone vibrated inside my jacket. It was my security chief. His voice was unusually tense. "Sir, I think you should know something. Someone has been watching Miss Carter and her daughter for the past 3 mornings. The same silver SUV. The same driver. And today, after you arrived, it did not leave." I did not answer immediately. Years of experience had taught me that reacting too quickly usually meant reacting emotionally. I kept my eyes on the library entrance where Emily had disappeared with Lily only moments earlier. Parents continued arriving with children carrying picture books and homework folders. A volunteer unlocked the community garden beside the building while 2 elderly women laughed over paper cups of coffee. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, exactly the kind of peaceful life Emily had always dreamed about. I refused to let that peace be disturbed. "How long?" I asked quietly. "For days," my security chief replied. "We only connected the pattern this morning after reviewing nearby traffic cameras." For days. Someone had been watching them before I even knew they existed. A cold weight settled in my chest. "Keep your distance," I said. "No confrontation. No unnecessary attention. I do not want Emily frightened because of me." "Understood." The call ended, but I remained standing on the sidewalk for another minute before returning to my car. Through the windshield, I could still see the library entrance reflected between rows of autumn trees. Somewhere inside, Lily was probably choosing another stack of books, while Emily reminded her not to check out more than she could carry home. The image felt so vivid that I could almost hear Lily laughing. It was a sound I had missed for 6 years without ever knowing it existed. That afternoon, I found myself unable to focus on work. Contracts sat unopened across my conference table while my executive team discussed expansion plans I barely heard. Every few minutes, my attention drifted back to the crayon drawing folded carefully inside my jacket pocket. Heroes always come back, even if they are late. Children believed time could fix almost anything. Adults knew better. Late arrivals often came with consequences that could never be erased. Just after 5 o'clock, my phone vibrated again. This time it was an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it until a small voice burst through the speaker before I could even introduce myself. Mr. Vincent? I froze. Lily, Mommy says I should not call strangers, but you are not really a stranger. I could not stop smiling. How did you get my number? She giggled proudly. It was on the business card the library lady gave Mommy after the fancy party. I remembered it. I leaned back in my chair, amazed that a 6-year-old had memorized 10 digits after seeing them only once. That is impressive. Mommy says I have elephant memory. I laughed quietly. I believe her. Her voice lowered to an exaggerated whisper. I wanted to say thank you for bringing my backpack back. Mommy cried after we got home. My heart sank. Was she upset? No. Lily answered so quickly that I knew she believed every word. Sometimes grown-ups cry because they remember happy things too. Before I could respond, another voice filled the line. Lily, sweetheart, who are you talking to? There was a brief silence followed by a tiny gasp. Oh. The phone changed hands. Emily did not speak for several seconds. I could hear only her breathing. Finally, she said, almost apologetically, I am sorry. She should not have called you. It is all right. Another long silence settled between us. Then, very softly, she asked the one question I never expected. Vincent, has anyone unusual been asking about us? I looked out the floor-to-ceiling window of my office before answering. The city below moved with its usual confidence. Yellow taxis weaving through traffic, people hurrying toward trains, completely unaware that one quiet question had just changed everything. Emily had never been the type to ask for help unless she had already exhausted every other option. Why? Are you asking? I said carefully. I heard her take a slow breath. Because for the past week, I have noticed the same silver sport utility vehicle parked near Lily's school, near the library, and outside our apartment building. My grip tightened around the phone. Did you report it? Report what? A car parked on a public street. Her voice remained calm, but I recognized the strain underneath it. I kept telling myself I was imagining things. I closed my eyes for a moment. She had been carrying this fear alone while trying to convince herself it was nothing. That sounded exactly like the Emily I remembered. She always minimized her own worries so other people would not have to carry them. Emily, I said quietly, listen to me very carefully. If you notice that vehicle again, do not approach it. Do not try to figure out who is inside. Just take Lily somewhere public and call me immediately. Another silence followed. So I am not imagining it. It was not really a question. I chose honesty. No. She exhaled slowly, and for the first time I heard genuine fear replacing uncertainty. I knew something felt wrong. Before I could say another word, Lily's cheerful voice floated into the background. Mommy, I found my library book about whales. Emily lowered the phone for a second to answer her daughter. That is wonderful, sweetheart. Put it in your backpack. Hearing them together made everything feel painfully real. This was no longer about unfinished conversations from the past. It was about protecting the family I had never known I still had. Vincent, Emily said after returning to the call, I do not want Lily scared. Neither do I. My answer came without hesitation. Then please promise me something. Anything. She paused. Do not solve this your way. I understood exactly what she meant. She remembered the man I had been 7 years ago, the man who believed every problem could be handled through control, influence, and distance. I was not that man anymore, or at least I wanted to believe I was not. I promise, I said. I will solve it the way that lets Lily keep believing the world is full of good people. She did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than it had been all day. Thank you. The call ended, but I remained seated with the phone still in my hand. Minutes later, my security chief entered my office carrying a tablet. He placed it silently on my desk. The screen displayed traffic camera images taken throughout the week. The same silver sport utility vehicle appeared outside Lily's elementary school on Monday morning, outside the neighborhood library on Tuesday afternoon, across from Emily's apartment building on Wednesday evening. Then another image appeared from only 20 minutes earlier. The vehicle was parked directly across the street from the library. The driver's window was partially lowered, and resting on the dashboard was a child's watercolor painting identical to the ones Lily loved to make. Whoever was watching them was no longer just observing. Somehow, they wanted us to know they had been paying attention. The images stayed on the screen long after everyone else had left my office. I enlarged each frame again and again, searching for something I had missed. A license plate, a reflection, a face. There was nothing. Whoever was behind the wheel understood exactly how to remain forgettable. Ordinary enough to disappear into Manhattan traffic, patient enough to wait for hours without drawing attention. My security chief finally broke the silence. "What are your orders?" I looked at the photographs one last time before locking the tablet. No confrontation. Double the surveillance around Emily and Lily, but they cannot know we are there. If they feel watched by us as well, we become part of the problem instead of the solution. He nodded once. Understood. I drove home that evening with the radio turned off, letting the quiet fill every corner of the car. For years I had convinced myself that distance was another form of love. Stay away. Keep her safe. Do not let your world become hers. Now I wondered if the greatest mistake of my life had not been leaving. Maybe it had been believing that leaving meant the danger disappeared with me. The following Saturday arrived with bright blue skies and the kind of crisp autumn air that made New York feel almost peaceful. One of my security officers called shortly after 10 in the morning. "Sir, Miss Carter and Lily are at Riverside Park. They are attending a neighborhood art fair." I glanced toward the framed crayon drawing resting against the corner of my desk. Before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed my jacket and left. I stayed well outside the festival, blending into the crowd of families wandering between handmade crafts and food stands. Children painted pumpkins while musicians played old jazz standards beneath colorful tents. Emily sat beside Lily at a folding table covered with watercolor paper. Lily's tongue peeked out slightly as she concentrated on painting an enormous blue whale with tiny yellow stars above it. Emily laughed gently after Lily accidentally splashed blue paint across her own sleeve. It was such an ordinary moment that it almost hurt to watch. Then Lily looked up and spotted me standing near a coffee cart. She waved both arms so enthusiastically that I had no chance of pretending I had not seen her. Emily followed her daughter's gaze. For an instant I expected her to ask me to leave. Instead, she simply sighed, as though she had run out of reasons to fight fate. Lily raced toward me holding her unfinished painting. "Look what I made." I crouched beside her. "That is the happiest whale I have ever seen." She beamed with pride. "Mommy says whales remember their families forever." I smiled. "Your mommy sounds very wise." Lily nodded seriously. "She tells me stories every night." Then she leaned closer, lowering her voice into another exaggerated whisper. "Sometimes she tells stories about you too." My heartbeat slowed. "Does she?" "Yes." Lily looked back toward Emily, who was speaking with another parent across the table. "She always says you loved us before you even knew I was coming." The world seemed to stop. I stared at the little girl, unable to breathe. She continued smiling, completely unaware that she had just answered the question that had haunted me since the charity gala. Emily had known. She had known she was pregnant before I disappeared. And somehow, through all these years, she had never allowed our daughter to believe she had been abandoned. My knees nearly gave out beneath me. For 7 years I had carried one version of the past, polished it until it felt like truth, and built an entire life around it. Emily had left. Emily wanted freedom. Emily had chosen a future without me. That story had been easier to survive than the possibility that I had walked away from both the woman I loved and the child I never knew existed. Lily had already skipped back toward the painting table before I found my voice again. Emily looked up and immediately recognized the expression on my face. She excused herself from the conversation she was having and walked toward me with slow, careful steps. "What did she say?" she asked quietly. I looked at her for several seconds, unable to hide the emotion I had spent years teaching myself to bury. "She said you told her I loved both of you before you knew she was coming." Emily closed her eyes. A soft autumn breeze lifted a few loose strands of her hair, but she did not brush them away. She simply stood there, as though she had known this moment would eventually arrive. "It is true," she whispered. "I found out 3 days after you left." I swallowed hard. Why did nobody tell me? She laughed once, but there was no joy in the sound. I tried. My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" She reached into her purse and carefully unfolded an old envelope that had clearly been opened and closed countless times over the years. The paper had yellowed around the edges, and the crease through the middle had nearly worn through. She handed it to me without a word. My own name was written across the front in her familiar handwriting. Vincent Moretti. The envelope had been stamped 7 years earlier. Across the top, in bold red letters, were 2 words that shattered everything I believed. "Return to sender." I stared at it in disbelief. Emily spoke so softly, I almost missed the words. "I wrote 3 letters. I called every number I had for you. None of them worked anymore. Then your apartment was empty." She looked toward Lily, who was proudly showing her whale painting to another little girl. "After a while, I stopped believing you had chosen to disappear because you wanted to. I started believing someone had made sure we could never find each other." I looked down at the envelope again. My executive assistant had changed every personal phone number and mailing address after a series of business security upgrades that same month. I had approved the changes without reading the details. Nobody had ever mentioned forwarded mail. Nobody had ever mentioned 3 letters from Emily. "I never received any of these," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know." She nodded gently. I realized that years ago, tears blurred my vision for the first time since I was a young man. Every birthday I had missed, every first day of school, every bedtime story, every drawing signed Daddy. None of it had been stolen by Emily. None of it had been stolen by choice. It had vanished because of a single broken chain of communication that neither of us knew existed. Emily stepped a little closer, her expression filled not with anger, but with quiet sadness. "Vincent, I never wanted Lily to grow up believing her father abandoned her. Children deserve better than adult mistakes." Before I could answer, my phone vibrated. My security chief sent only one sentence. "The silver sport utility vehicle has just entered the parking lot again. This time it is parked less than 50 yards from the children's art tent." I slipped my phone back into my pocket without changing my expression. Emily noticed anyway. She had always been able to read me long before I spoke. "What is it?" she asked quietly. I looked toward the parking lot beyond the rows of colorful tents where families wandered between food trucks and handmade crafts. Somewhere beyond the maple trees, the silver sport utility vehicle was waiting again. "Nothing I am going to let ruin today," I answered. Then I did something I had never done before in my entire life. Instead of taking control, I chose trust. I sent one short message to my security team. "Stay invisible. Protect everyone. Do not interrupt unless absolutely necessary. No flashing lights. No panic. No confrontation." Within seconds, I received a single reply. "Understood." Emily studied my face for another moment before nodding almost imperceptibly. Somehow she knew I had kept the promise I made over the phone. I had chosen Lily's peace over my own instincts. Just then Lily came running back toward us carrying her whale painting, now covered with tiny silver stars that glittered in the afternoon sunlight. "Mommy, they are giving everybody family pictures over there." She pointed toward a volunteer photographer setting up beside a line of bright orange pumpkins. "Can we take one?" Emily looked uncertain. Her eyes met mine. Neither of us spoke. We had missed too many years already. Finally she smiled, the smallest smile, but the most genuine one I had seen since the bookstore 7 years earlier. "I think we can." Lily grabbed both our hands before either of us had the chance to hesitate. She pulled us toward the photographer, laughing the entire way. "Stand closer," the volunteer said cheerfully while adjusting the camera. "Families always look happier when they forget about the space between them." Emily and I exchanged an awkward glance before taking one small step closer. Lily squeezed our hands tightly and looked up with complete satisfaction. The camera clicked. It lasted less than 1 second, but somehow that single photograph held everything I had spent 7 years searching for without realizing it. Not perfection, not erased mistakes, just a beginning. As we thanked the photographer, my security chief walked casually past the booth carrying a cup of coffee. He never looked directly at me, but as he continued toward the parking lot, he touched 2 fingers lightly against the side of the cup, our old signal that everything was under control. Minutes later, another message appeared on my phone. The silver sport utility vehicle has left the area. No further activity observed. I slipped the phone away without reading it twice. For once, my attention belonged somewhere else. Lily reached into her backpack and pulled out one last crayon drawing. This time there were no stick figures. No captions. Just a small white house beneath a blue sky with 3 people standing on the front porch holding hands. She handed it to me with the same quiet confidence she had shown from the beginning. "This one is for you," she said. "So you remember where home is." I could not speak. I simply knelt in front of my daughter and nodded. Emily rested one gentle hand on my shoulder, and for the first time in 7 years neither of us was carrying the past alone. I had once believed power was measured by how much of the world a man could control. I was wrong. Real strength began the moment I stopped trying to rewrite yesterday and finally became worthy of tomorrow. Sometimes the greatest empire a man will ever build is not made of money, influence, or fear. Sometimes it begins with a little girl who still believes heroes can find their way home, even when they are late.